At the family barbecue, my brother's 12-year-old son stepped in front of the buffet table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Charity cases eat last." A few people laughed. My brother heard it and did nothing. My parents stood a few feet away, suddenly, very interested in the flower arrangements. I remember holding my plate, feeling the heat of 100 silent judgments in the air. And in that moment, something inside me went completely still. Because what none of them knew was that by the next morning, everything they owned would be on the line. The lake house lawn had been transformed into something that looked less like a family gathering and more like a carefully staged commercial for success. My parents had spent a small fortune, about $50,000, I later learned, to celebrate Vanguard Logistics' 40th anniversary. White tents stretched across the grass like sails. Crystal glasses clinked in the thick summer air. And in the corner, a string quartet played soft classical music while quietly melting inside their tuxedos. The humidity didn't just hang in the air, it pressed down on everything. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with grilled seafood and lake water, creating that strange atmosphere you only get at events where people are trying very hard to impress each other. Because that's what this party really was, not a celebration, a performance. Investors had been invited, potential clients too. The whole place had been arranged like a showroom, proof that Vanguard Logistics was thriving, expanding, unstoppable. Except I knew better. Numbers have a way of cutting through illusions, and I had seen the balance sheet. Beneath the polished speeches and the lobster towers was a company stretched thinner than anyone wanted to admit. But no one at the party wanted reality. They wanted the show. So the show continued. Christopher, my older brother and the company's chief operating officer, stood near the open bar like the star of the evening. His suit probably cost more than my first car. He laughed loudly, clapped potential clients on the shoulder, and carried himself like a man who had personally built the empire everyone was admiring. His wife Morgan stayed close beside him. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes were always scanning the crowd, searching for someone more important to talk to. She had perfected that social glide, moving from one conversation to another without ever quite acknowledging the people who didn't matter. People like me. I stood near the edge of the lawn with a glass of lukewarm water, watching the whole thing unfold from the perimeter. That had always been my position in the family. Not quite outside, but never truly inside either. If family dynamics had a shape, mine would be geometry. Christopher was the center of the circle, the golden child, the heir, the one everything revolved around. My parents orbited him, proudly polishing every achievement until it gleamed. And me, I was the margin of the page, technically part of the picture, but easy to overlook. It didn't matter that I had spent the entire morning reviewing portfolio adjustments for clients whose combined assets topped $200 million. My family didn't see that version of me. To them, I was still the quiet one with the boring city job, the one who pushed papers somewhere in an office tower, a harmless extra in the background of their story. As the evening wore on, servers carried out trays stacked with lobster tails, oysters on crushed ice, and towers of shrimp that looked like edible sculptures. Guests laughed a little louder with each round of drinks. And somewhere in the middle of all that wealth and noise, I realized something Simple. I was starving. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. So eventually I walked toward the buffet tables, reached for a plate, and that's when the moment happened. The buffet table looked like something out of a luxury magazine spread. Towers of shrimp curled over bowls of crushed ice. Oysters sat in neat rows, glistening under the soft lights strung across the tent. Lobster tails were arranged like trophies. I reached for a plate. And that's when Mason stepped in front of me. He didn't bump into me by accident. He planted himself there right between me and the chilled prawns like a tiny gatekeeper guarding a castle wall. Christopher's son, 12 years old. Same sharp jawline as his father, same smug little half-smile. He looked me up and down with a confidence that no child invents on their own. That kind of confidence is taught, absorbed. He crossed his arms and said loud enough for several people to hear, "Dad says charity cases eat last." For a second, the moment hung there. The string quartet kept playing in the background, but a few nearby conversations paused. A couple of guests turned their heads. Someone gave a short, awkward chuckle, the kind people use when they're not sure if they're supposed to laugh. I didn't look at Mason first. I looked past him. Christopher was standing about 10 feet away with a glass of scotch in his hand. He had definitely heard it. Our eyes met for half a second. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't correct his son. He just smirked and took a slow sip of his drink. That was all the confirmation Mason needed. Behind Christopher, my parents were standing near one of the floral arrangements they'd spent thousands on. My father suddenly found the roses very interesting. My mother adjusted one of the stems like it required her full attention. No one stepped in. No one said that's enough. And in that moment, something strange happened inside my head. You'd think humiliation feels hot, like a flush rising in your face. But what I felt wasn't heat. It was cold. Very, very cold clarity. People think family trauma is one dramatic moment. One big explosion that changes everything overnight. It's not like that. It's more like a bank account. For 31 years, I had been making deposits into what I privately thought of as my bank of tolerance. I deposited my silence when they forgot my college graduation. I deposited my dignity every time someone made a joke about my boring little office job. I deposited my pride during holidays where Christopher told stories about the company while I sat quietly at the end of the table like an extra chair nobody remembered buying. Every small insult went into the account, and I kept assuming something naive that if I made enough deposits, if I was patient enough someday, the balance would turn into love. But standing there at the shrimp tower, watching a 12-year-old boy repeat his father's cruelty like it was family tradition, I realized something. The account wasn't just empty, it was overdrawn. The laughter around us faded back into normal party noise. Someone picked up a tray. A waiter walked past with champagne flutes. Life moved on like nothing had happened. Mason was still standing there waiting for my reaction. I looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. He wasn't born cruel. Kids learn their rules from the adults who raise them. And right then I understood something else too. This wasn't just a rude comment from a child. This was the family culture I had been quietly financing for years. Understood, I said softly. I set the empty plate back on the stack. The sound it made, just a small click of ceramic, felt strangely final. I didn't look at Christopher again. I didn't look at my parents. Behind me, Morgan's voice cut across the lawn. "Alyssa, don't be dramatic. He's just a kid." I didn't answer. The gravel path crunched under my heels as I walked toward this side gate past the valet stand and the rows of polished luxury cars. I got into my modest sedan and closed the door, and just like that, I wasn't leaving a party. I was leaving the account behind. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled away from the lake house. Behind me, the music was still playing. Laughter drifted through the humid air. Crystal glasses were still clinking like nothing had happened. To them, the party continued. But inside the car, everything went quiet. I drove with the windows up and the air conditioning blasting against the sweat on my neck. The road curved along the lake for a few miles before disappearing into the dark tree line, and with every mile, the noise of the party faded further behind me. 40 minutes later, it felt like I had crossed into another world entirely. My apartment building sat in the financial district, surrounded by steel and glass towers that reflected the city lights like mirrors. The lobby was cool and silent when I stepped inside, the kind of silence money buys, the polished, filtered kind where even footsteps seem quieter. I rode the elevator up to the top floor. My place wasn't huge in the flashy penthouse party way people imagine. It was quiet, minimal. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, and the air carried a faint scent of lemon verbena from the diffuser near the kitchen. No family photos, just modern art, clean lines, and the soft glow of the city stretching out below. I kicked off my heels and set my keys on the counter. This apartment had been paid for in cash 3 years earlier. My family had no idea. To them, I was a mid-level office worker somewhere downtown. The quiet one with a safe job. The person who handled paperwork while real money moved around in rooms I supposedly wasn't invited into. They thought I balanced checkbooks. In reality, I managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The difference between those two perceptions wasn't an accident. I had learned early that correcting them never changed anything. When a family decides who you are, facts rarely matter. There's a term sociologists use for people like me: glass children. Usually it describes kids who grow up in families where one child needs constant attention because of illness, talent, or some larger narrative the family builds around them. The other child grows up healthy, capable, and therefore invisible. They're not broken, so they aren't fixed. They're not special, so they aren't celebrated. They're just transparent. People look right through them. Christopher had always been the opposite of transparent. He was the golden child, the heir to the company, the one my parents polished and displayed like a trophy. Every achievement, real or exaggerated, was magnified until it filled the entire room. When Christopher failed the bar exam twice, my parents called it bad luck. When he took a high-ranking title at the company, they called it destiny. Meanwhile, I had spent my 20s building something real. Aggressive trading, high-risk positions, long nights staring at markets most people didn't even understand. By the time I turned 30, my personal net worth had crossed $20 million, but at family dinners, I was still Alyssa with the boring job. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands were perfectly steady. Because the truth was, the biggest financial decision of my life had never been a stock trade or a hedge position. It had been Vanguard Logistics. And tonight, for the first time in years, I was finally ready to collect on that investment. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit up the quiet apartment, reflecting off the glass windows behind me. Down below, the city moved the way it always does, traffic lights blinking, people rushing between buildings, deals being made and broken in offices stacked on top of each other. But the biggest deal of my life had started 5 years earlier. And it hadn't happened in a boardroom. It had happened at my parents' dining table. Back then, Vanguard Logistics was days away from collapse. Most people outside the company didn't know it yet. On paper, things still looked respectable. The trucks were still moving. The headquarters still had polished floors and glass doors with the company logo etched into them. But underneath the surface, the numbers were rotting. My father, Joseph, had made a decision that looked bold at the time. He had leveraged the company's entire fleet as collateral to finance a brand new downtown headquarters, a gleaming building that Christopher insisted the company needed to look serious. Christopher loved appearances. Banks love collateral. And when the freight market tightened that year, the math stopped working. The loans started calling themselves due. Lines of credit shrank. Interests piled up. Within weeks, the company was facing liquidation. Trucks could be seized, contracts canceled. 40 years of work erased in a few brutal signatures. I remember the dinner when it finally broke through my father's pride. He sat at the head of the table with a glass of scotch and a stack of papers he kept flipping through, like the numbers might change if he stared long enough. Christopher was pacing. My mother was silent. For the first time in my life, my father looked afraid. Not just worried, afraid. Not because of the money, because of the shame. A public bankruptcy would destroy the image he had spent decades building. Investors would talk. Competitors would celebrate. The legacy he loved to brag about would become a cautionary tale. I sat there listening to them panic, and I realized something that night. I had the money to fix it. Years of aggressive trading in my 20s had left me with more capital than anyone in my family suspected. Risk had been my specialty. While they were polishing Christopher's resume, I had been building something far less visible and far more powerful. But if I offered to save them directly, two things would happen. First, they would never accept it. Their pride wouldn't allow it. And second, if they did accept it, they would never respect it. To them, my money would always feel like a child's allowance, something temporary, something they were entitled to manage. So I did something different. I built a mask. Through a corporate attorney, I created a shell investment company called Ironclad Capital. It existed on paper as a private funding group specializing in distressed, mid-sized logistics firms. No family connection, no familiar names, just lawyers, documents, and a carefully structured offer. Ironclad Capital approached Vanguard Logistics as an anonymous investor. The proposal was simple, a $5.1 million capital injection. The money would immediately eliminate the company's most toxic debt, stabilize their fleet financing, and provide enough breathing room to restructure operations. In exchange, Ironclad Capital would receive 37% equity in Vanguard Logistics and a silent board seat. No public announcement, no controlling stake, just protection for the investment. I wired the money 2 weeks later. The debt disappeared almost overnight. The banks backed off. The trucks kept running. Employees kept their jobs. And inside the company, the narrative changed instantly. My father gave a speech about his strategic connections. Christopher bragged about negotiating with serious investors. The family celebrated their own brilliance. No one asked who Ironclad Capital actually was. They didn't ask because they didn't care. To them, the investor was just another proof of their greatness. Of course, someone would want to save their company. Of course, the market recognized their value. Meanwhile, I went back to being Alyssa, the quiet one with the boring job. At holidays, Christopher still told stories about the deal he closed that saved the company. My parents nodded proudly. Sometimes they would even joke that I should thank Christopher for protecting the family legacy. I would smile politely and sip my wine, because correcting them would have required something they had never given me in the first place: respect. And over time, something else became clear. Saving them hadn't changed anything. Not the jokes, not the dismissive looks, not the way conversations drifted right past me like I wasn't in the room. They took the money, they celebrated the rescue, and then they went right back to treating me like furniture, which is why 5 years later, sitting alone in my quiet penthouse with the city glowing outside the windows, I finally accepted a simple truth. They had never cared who saved them, but they were about to find out. The apartment had settled into that deep, nighttime quiet that only cities get after midnight. The kind where the traffic noise fades into a distant hum and the lights in neighboring buildings begin blinking out one by one. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the skyline when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen said Dad. For a moment, I almost laughed. I had walked out of the party less than an hour earlier. No one had followed me. No one had asked if I was okay. No apology. No, are you all right? Just silence. Until now. I opened the message. Alyssa, we needed to talk tomorrow. The fleet expansion is over budget. We might need a small personal loan to bridge things until next quarter. Family helps. Family. I read it twice. Not once in that message did he ask why I had left the party. Not once did he mention Mason's comment, or Christopher's smirk, or the way the entire family had watched it happen without saying a word. To him, the only relevant fact was money. Not concern. Liquidity. A bridge loan? It wasn't even disguised as a request. It was framed like a natural extension of my role in the family. Family helps family. Except I had already helped. $5 million worth of help. They just didn't know it. I set the phone down on the desk and leaned back in the chair. Outside the windows, the city lights flickered like 1,000 silent witnesses. For a long time, I had believed that if I kept contributing, kept supporting them quietly, from the background, something would eventually change. But that message made something very clear. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a funding source, a backup account they could tap whenever the numbers stopped working. And tonight, after 31 years of deposits into that bank of tolerance, the account had finally closed. I opened my laptop. A secure email client waited on the screen. I typed a familiar name into the recipient line. David, my attorney, the man who officially represented Ironclad Capital. The subject line was simple. Vanguard Logistics, liquidity event. My fingers rested on the keyboard for a moment before I began typing. David, effective. Immediately. Ironclad Capital will be exercising its option under Section 4, Paragraph B of the shareholder agreement. We are formally requesting a full buyout of our 37% equity stake at current fair market value. I paused. That clause had been buried deep in the contract 5 years earlier. A protection mechanism in case the investment ever needed to exit quickly. Most companies never expected it to be triggered. If Vanguard Logistics cannot provide the required liquidity within 30 days, I continued, please proceed with the forced sale provision as outlined in the agreement. There is no room for negotiation. I reread the message once. Short, clean, irreversible. Then I added the final line, proceed. For a moment, my cursor hovered over the send button. 5 years of silence, about to end with one click. When the email left my outbox, It made the softest sound imaginable. Just a quiet digital swoosh. But somewhere across the city and very soon inside my father's office, that little sound was going to land like an explosion. Because the invisible daughter had just become the most dangerous shareholder in the company. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, the email landed in my father's inbox. David never wasted time. The notice from Ironclad Capital was short, clinical, and devastatingly precise. It stated that the minority shareholder was exercising its liquidity rights under the agreement signed 5 years earlier. Vanguard Logistics had 30 days to produce $13.7 million in cash to buy out Ironclad's 37% stake. If they couldn't, the forced sale clause would activate and the entire company would be placed on the market. No negotiation, no extensions, just a countdown. I was sitting in my office downtown when my phone started vibrating against the desk. Once, twice, then again. Dad. Christopher. Dad again. I let it buzz. Outside my office windows, the city was already moving. Cars sliding through intersections, people rushing into glass towers with coffee in their hands. Somewhere across town, inside the Vanguard headquarters my father loved so much, panic was beginning to spread. Around noon, I called David. "It's pandemonium," he said calmly. Like a doctor describing a patient's symptoms, your father has called my office 5 times already. He's claiming this is a hostile maneuver. He wants to know who the investor is, and I asked. I reminded him that the identity of Ironclad Capital's principal investor is protected under the original agreement, David said. The same agreement he signed without reading too carefully. I leaned back in my chair. Do they have the money? David gave a small laugh. Not even close. Most of their liquidity is tied up in Christopher's expansion projects. They tried to draw from their credit line this morning, and the bank froze it. Rumors of a forced sale make lenders nervous. Of course they did. Within hours, the company was cornered. And like most cornered people, they lashed out at the nearest available target. At 2 p.m., my phone rang again. This time I answered. "Alyssa." My father said, his voice tight with the kind of stress he was trying very hard to disguise. "We have a situation at the company." A situation. That was one way to describe it. Minor administrative issue with an investor. He continued quickly. "Nothing serious, but we need to show some liquidity to calm the banks." I waited. Then he said it. "We need a bridge loan, just temporary. 500,000 should do it." 500,000. He was asking me for money. To fight me. To stabilize the company long enough to push back against Ironclad Capital. My own investment. "I can't do that, Dad," I said calmly. Silence filled the line for a second. "What do you mean you can't?" he snapped. "You have that job in the city. You must have savings." We're talking about the family legacy here. There it was again. Legacy. Christopher's future. Christopher's children. The same family that had laughed when his son called me a charity case. "I don't have 500,000, I said quietly. It was a lie. And even if I did, I wouldn't lend it to a sinking ship. His breath exploded through the phone. "How dare you?" he shouted. "We built everything you have. Family sticks together during a crisis." I stared out the window at the skyline. "You abandoned me a long time ago," I said. "You just didn't notice because I was still useful." Then I hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again, not with a call this time, but a notification. Morgan had posted a photo online. It showed her and Christopher standing together, both looking stressed, but determined the caption carefully crafted for maximum sympathy. Hard times reveal true loyalty. Sad when people you thought you could count on forget where they came from. Family first. Fake people. I looked at the screen for a moment. They thought they were exposing me. What they didn't realize was something much simpler. The person they were calling fake was the only one who could save them. And I had already decided not to. The 30 days passed faster than anyone expected. At first, my father was confident they would solve it. He made calls to banks, investors, old business partners, anyone who might be willing to extend credit long enough to buy out ironclad capital. Christopher tried the same approach, leaning on the same charm he used at parties and client dinners. But charm doesn't work well when people smell risk. And a forced sale clause smells like blood in the water. The banks were the first to pull back. Once the legal notice circulated, lenders froze the company's credit lines. No one wanted to extend millions to a business that might be auctioned off in a month. Then the investors started asking questions. Too many questions. Why did a minority shareholder suddenly want out? What did they know that everyone else didn't? The answers didn't inspire confidence. Within 2 weeks, the phone calls my father made were no longer confident negotiations. They were quiet, desperate requests. Christopher even tried showing up at my apartment building one evening, demanding to speak to me. The doorman turned him away before he ever reached the elevator. I watched from my balcony as he paced the sidewalk, yelling into his phone. For the first time in his life, the math wasn't working in his favor. 30 days later, the deadline arrived. They hadn't raised the money. The forced sale clause activated automatically. Ironclad capital moved quickly. Within days, Vanguard Logistics was sold to a private equity firm known for one thing: efficiency. The kind of efficiency that trims companies down to their most profitable parts and discards everything else. The papers were signed, the deal closed. My 37% stake was bought out for $12.9 million. But before the transition could finalize, there was one last meeting. The closing meeting was scheduled at Ironclad Capital's headquarters on the 42nd floor of a glass tower downtown. David told me my family believed they were finally going to meet the anonymous investor who had forced the sale. They assumed it would be some faceless financier, someone older, powerful, untouchable. They were half right. I arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist recognized me immediately and gave a small nod before buzzing me through to the boardroom. Inside, my family was already seated around the long mahogany table. My father looked 10 years older than he had at the garden party. His shoulders were slumped, his tie slightly crooked. Christopher was red-faced, whispering angrily to Morgan, who sat beside him with her arms crossed. My mother stared out the window like she was trying to process a landscape she didn't recognize anymore. The door closed softly behind me. Every head turned. Christopher frowned. "Alyssa," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." I walked slowly toward the head of the table. "The meeting you're waiting for," I said calmly. I pulled out the chair at the head and sat down. "That's me." Silence dropped into the room like a weight. My father blinked at me, confused. "What is this?" he asked. David stepped forward near the window, holding a file. "This," I said quietly, "is the liquidity event you've been trying to stop." My mother looked between us, her voice trembling. "I don't understand." I folded my hands on the table. "The $5 million that saved Vanguard Logistics 5 years ago," I said. "The capital that paid off your debt. The investor who kept the trucks moving." I met each of their eyes. That was me. Christopher pushed his chair back so fast it scraped loudly against the floor. "You're lying," he snapped. "You're a portfolio manager. You don't have that kind of money." "Sit down, Christopher." My voice stayed calm, but the authority in it made him freeze. Slowly, reluctantly, he sat. "I spent a decade managing high-risk assets," I continued. "While you were building a reputation, I was building capital." I glanced down at the documents in front of me, and when you needed saving, I did it anonymously, because I knew something important. I looked back up. "If you knew the money came from me, you would never respect it." The room went completely still, because in that moment they finally understood something they had spent 31 years ignoring. The invisible daughter they mocked had been holding their entire future in her hands. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. You could almost hear the gears in their heads, grinding, trying to force this new reality into the version of the world they had always believed. Christopher was the first to recover. "This is ridiculous," he said, leaning forward with a bitter laugh. "Fine, let's say you invested. The company was just sold for millions. That means we still walk away with our shares." My father straightened slightly, clinging to the same idea. "Yes," he said quickly. "The sale proceeds. We should discuss how those are being distributed." There it was. Even now, even after everything they had just learned, they were still calculating the payout, still assuming the ending would work out in their favor. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands. "That brings us to the second item on the agenda," I said calmly. Morgan frowned. "Second item?" "The transition audit." Christopher blinked. "What audit?" "The one required by the acquiring firm," I said. "Private equity buyers prefer clean books. No hidden liabilities. No questionable spending." I slid a thick stack of folders across the mahogany table. "They appointed a transition controller to review the company's financial activity over the past 5 years. My father's eyes narrowed. "And who is this controller?" I met his gaze. "Me." Silence again. Then I opened the first folder. "Christopher," I said, flipping to a highlighted page. "Let's start with last year's client development retreat in Cabo San Lucas." Christopher shifted in his chair. "That was a strategy meeting," he said quickly. "There were no clients in Cabo," I replied. "Just you, Morgan, and a 5-star resort." I tapped the receipt. $75,000 charged to the company card. His face went pale. "That's classified as embezzlement." Morgan leaned forward, her voice rising. "That trip was for networking." "Interesting," I said evenly. "Because the resort billed 2 couples massages, a private yacht charter, and 12 spa treatments." Neither of them spoke. I turned another page. "Next item, the company vehicle lease." Morgan's head snapped up. "A luxury SUV registered to Vanguard Logistics. Driven exclusively by you." She stiffened. "We needed a safe car for the kids." "You don't work for the company," I said, quietly. "That's $1,200 a month in misappropriated funds." Her mouth opened, then closed again. I moved to the final folder. My father still hadn't looked up. "Joseph," I said. He slowly raised his eyes. "Consulting payments to a shell company registered in your name. $200,000 over 3 years. Plus the country club membership. Plus the business dinners that coincidentally occur every year on your wedding anniversary." His hand slammed the table. "I founded this company," he snapped. "I'm entitled to certain perks. You're entitled to a salary," I corrected. "You're not entitled to treat investor capital like a personal slush fund." I closed the folder. The sound echoed through the room. "The acquiring firm has a clawback clause," I continued. "Before any equity payout can be distributed, all misappropriated funds must be repaid to the company. Christopher leaned forward slowly. What are you saying? I reached into the desk organizer and picked up a pair of scissors. Then I gathered the 3 corporate credit cards lying on the table in front of them. Symbols of their status, their power, their lifestyle. When we subtract the unauthorized spending from the value of your shares, I said calmly. Picking up Christopher's platinum card, the balance is 0. Snip. The card split cleanly in half. Christopher stared at the plastic pieces like they might magically reattach themselves. I picked up Morgan's. Snip. Then my father's. Snipped. The room felt suddenly smaller. You're leaving us with nothing, Christopher whispered. I brushed the broken pieces into a small pile. There is no payout, I said. But the sale was worth millions, Morgan said weakly. Yes, I replied. But over the last 5 years, the 3 of you spent those millions already, pretending you were rich. Christopher's voice cracked. But the house, Mason's school, we already planned everything. Then you made a bad investment. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. You wanted to run a family business, I continued quietly. But you forgot the most important rule of business. I nodded toward the pile of broken cards. You have to pay for what you take. Christopher was the first to break. The moment the implications settled in no severance, no shares, no assets protected by the company. His composure cracked like thin glass. The confident executive posture he had carried into the meeting vanished, replaced by frantic calculation. His eyes darted between the documents on the table and the silent board members who now avoided his gaze. This can't stand, he muttered, his voice tightening. Alyssa, think about what you're doing. My salary, our accounts, my house. He stopped himself mid-sentence, realizing the words sounded pathetic even to him. But the panic was already spilling out. My wife, do you understand what this means? The mortgage is tied to my compensation package. The school tuition, His voice rose brittle with fear. You're destroying my life over some accounting technicality. Alyssa didn't respond. Across the table, Morgan had gone completely still. The color drained from his face as he stared at the neatly stacked audit report. The page detailing the company-funded SUV purchase order insurance payments, personal mileage logs, sat exposed like a confession. He rubbed his hands over his temples. They can't claw all that back, he whispered. That's years of compensation. It was never compensation, Alyssa replied calmly. It was fraud. Her father looked older than she had ever seen him. For most of the meeting, he had tried to maintain authority, tried to project the commanding presence that had built the company decades earlier. But now, the illusion was collapsing. His shoulders sagged. Alyssa, he said quietly. The room fell silent. Listen to me. We can fix this. There are ways to restructure the repayments, installments, deferred reconciliation. If we work together, number. The word was immediate. He blinked, startled. I'm your father, he said, his voice trembling now. You don't have to do this like this. Give us time. 30 days, 60. Let us get our affairs in order. For a moment, the desperation stripped away his pride completely. Please. The boardroom air felt heavy, suffocating. Christopher stared at Alyssa as if hoping for a crack in her resolve. Morgan's breathing had grown shallow. Her father's hands trembled slightly against the polished table. But Alyssa's expression remained unchanged. There was no anger left in her face, only clarity. You already had time, she said evenly. Years of it. She gathered the final folder from the table and closed it with quiet precision. The clawback clause is immediate. all misappropriated funds are due before any executive payout, equity redemption, or severance consideration. Since the amount exceeds your holdings, she let the sentence hang. Christopher understood first. That means, yes, Alyssa said. Your shares are worthless. The words landed like a hammer. Her father lowered his head into his hands. Christopher leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if the room were collapsing around him. Morgan simply stared at the table. Alyssa stood. For a moment, she looked at her father, not with cruelty, but with a distant recognition of someone who had finally stepped outside a long illusion. You built this company, she said quietly, but you also destroyed it. He lifted his head slowly, eyes red. Alyssa, please. She paused at the door. Her final words were soft but absolute. You taught me that leadership means making the decision no one else will. Then she opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and walked away, leaving the boardroom and her family behind. The sale closed 3 weeks later. The process itself was almost anticlimactic. After months of negotiations, the final signatures were exchanged over a quiet video call with lawyers, auditors, and the acquisition team. No celebration, no dramatic announcement, just a sequence of legal confirmations and digital approvals. When the last document was finalized, the transfer notification appeared on Alyssa's screen. $12,900,000. The number sat there for a long moment. For years, that figure, or something like it, had been the unspoken objective of everyone in the company. Growth targets, aggressive expansions, questionable executive expenses, endless meetings about valuation and exit strategies. It had been the promise used to justify everything. Now it was simply a line in her account. Alyssa closed the laptop. She didn't buy a penthouse in a city skyline. She didn't lease sports cars or schedule interviews with financial magazines. The money went mostly untouched, except for taxes, investments, and a few quiet decisions made with the same methodical clarity she had shown in the boardroom. 6 months later, she purchased a small house in the mountains. It sat at the end of a narrow road surrounded by pine trees and long stretches of silence. The property wasn't extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a wide porch, facing a valley and windows that filled the rooms with pale morning light. The nearest town was 30 minutes away. It was quiet. For the first time in years, her days weren't structured by board meetings or investor calls. She read more, hiked long trails that wound through the hills, occasionally consulted for small companies' projects where the work felt straightforward and honest. The money remained largely theoretical security more than lifestyle. One afternoon, nearly a year after the sale, a letter arrived. The envelope carried her father's handwriting. Alyssa sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully. The letter was shorter than she expected. He didn't try to defend what had happened. There were no arguments about technicalities, no attempts to rewrite the past. Instead, the words moved slowly across the page as if they had taken a long time to form. He wrote that losing the company had forced him to confront things he had ignored for years. His pride, his shortcuts, the ways he had dismissed her judgment when it didn't align with his own. You saw what I refused to see, one line read. Another sentence stopped her for a moment. I underestimated you because you were my daughter instead of recognizing you were the most capable person in the room. Near the end, he wrote simply, I'm sorry. There was no request for reconciliation, no plea for forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Alyssa finished reading and folded the letter back into the envelope. She didn't feel anger, but she didn't feel satisfaction either. What lingered instead was something quieter, a sense that the long conflict between them had finally resolved itself. Not through reconciliation or victory, but through the clean logic of consequence. A transaction completed. She placed the envelope in a drawer beside the kitchen desk and closed it gently. Outside, the wind moved through the trees along the mountain ridge, carrying the steady sound of branches shifting in the afternoon light. Alyssa stepped onto the porch and looked out across the valley. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to settle. That evening, Alyssa finally sat down to dinner with no tension in the room, no voices questioning her place at the table. For most of her life, she'd been treated like the outsider, the charity case who should be grateful just to be there. But tonight, in the quiet of her mountain home, she realized something simple. The charity case was finally eating first. If you've ever had to draw hard boundaries with family, you probably understand that feeling. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share them below, and thanks for being here.